Russian successes on the battlefields of Ukraine have slowed to a crawl, and in many places, we're seeing the Ukrainians roll back Russian forces. Is one reason the Ukrainian ability to turn Russian FAB bombs into scrap? Just how is Russia's most feared battlefield weapon suddenly useless? Plus, we're going to talk about the mineral deal and why the Ukrainian cabinet is saying this one is good to go. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this I thought was a really crazy story because even when I was in Ukraine, the soldiers there talked with fear about the FAB bombs. These are 500-pound bombs that are guided using the Russian GPS equivalent, and they are glide bombs. And so that means that Russian fixed-wing aircraft will release them far from the front line, and they will glide in, relying on, again, corrections in their GPS coordinates to walk them onto the targets. So while they're not super precise the way a so-called smart bomb might be, they do maintain a pretty high level of accuracy, and most importantly, they have the payload large enough to absolutely destroy even hardened targets. And so for Ukraine, solving the FAB bomb problem has been, well, really a pressing issue. But it sounds like they've found at least one counter. That is, Ukrainian jamming systems, right, have been working tirelessly near the front lines, meaning that at least as those bombs get closer to the front lines, they can no longer talk to the GLONASS satellites, meaning that they are unable to correct errors in their guidance, and reportedly it's taking up to 16 rounds of FAB bombs to hit a single target. This is a huge change from what Russia was really able to do before with them, which is use them as a sort of not quite deep strike weapon, but to target individual Ukrainian positions with a pretty high level of precision that doesn't require them to deploy, say, a full artillery system and crew to the front lines, right? And this has been something that I think has been essential to kind of the Russian strategy, in which they rely primarily on suppression and standoff distance weapons like artillery, MLRS systems, and of course FAB bombs to take out Ukrainian positions that are identified through the use of light infantry assaults. And so this whole process, this whole jamming thing has really paid dividends for the Ukrainians, right? In one instance, for example, Russia has been failing to take Pokrovsk for literally months. This is a town that is along some fairly critical roadways, right? You can see here that these roadways are effectively resupplying large portions of this front line. But you can see that not only has Russian advances and efforts to close on Pokrovsk stalled out, but you actually have in some places Ukrainian forces pushing back, driving Russian forces back in places. This is something that's fairly unprecedented, certainly this year and maybe in the last 6 months. Ukraine has not been really willing to assume the risk of even localized offensive operations. But the fact is that without accurate FAB bombs, the Russian armed forces simply struggle to find an answer to these to continue their offensive effort, right? This is combined with the fact that reportedly Russian recruitment numbers have been down. And so there's been both higher attrition and less backfill from the Russian forces, and some of their key close air support has been pulled off or reduced tremendously in effectiveness. And this combines to what you're seeing here, which is, again, not dramatic, but localized places. And as you can see, we go back in time, right? Draw in your mind a circle around Pokrovsk. And you can see that while in places Russia has advanced, it's not advancing closer to the actual town of Pokrovsk. And again, this is, I think, a really critical illustration. Here we are at the start of 2025, 2 months ago. That was the last time you saw Russian forces make any kind of meaningful advance. And even this, while it's trying to part of the encirclement effort of Pokrovsk, it isn't actually moving them closer to the main city center. So this isn't just the this isn't the whole story, right? As we've pointed out, that Ukrainian paratroopers are actually the ones who are responsible for what you saw there, the liberation of Kotlyne. And I think this is really interesting, again, primarily because it not because this is some sort of stunning giant breakthrough, but primarily because this is a reflection of the willingness of the Ukrainians to go on the offensive. And the how, I think, is as important as anything else, right? This is, of course, was a combined arms operation, right? With more than a month of planning behind it, right? Russian troops, of course. Let's see. Drone footage showed Ukrainian forces infiltrating into the village at night. And Russian soldiers, I think this is critical, coming under fire from anti-personnel grenades as they retreated, right? 2 companies of Russian soldiers, some 150 to 250 men, were destroyed running what they call a gauntlet. And this is what I want to point out here, that it appears has gone down, right? So right here, we'll zoom it in. We'll look at Kotlyne here. And you can see that for Russian troops, right, they're in the village, and then there's the actual tree line itself, which remains under Russian control. And so I think essentially what they did is likely try to push Russian forces out via this lone roadway towards more friendly forces. And as Ukrainians sort of took up positions here, they likely had drones overhead watching this one key avenue of retreat in Kotlyne. And honestly, that's probably where they targeted these troops, right? Because anytime you can canalize your enemy into a small area, you can really piece them up. And one of the other critical parts is actually this Pishjane effort here, because you notice that it effectively forms a block, right? Especially if they're willing to run drones out of some of these areas, right? And the drones, if you assume around a 13-kilometer range for drones, which is about what we see, you could see that actually even drone operators sitting in Pokrovsk proper can range their drones out and effectively cut off reinforcements that might be trying to, again, cross this river here. Right. And so there's no there. So you see how bad it is to be one of these Russians in Kotlyne. They are cut off from resupply, cut off from reinforcements. And then when they see the Ukrainians pushing into them, particularly at night, they are going to run in a panic. And the Ukrainians with drones overhead were able to cut them off at this critical juncture. So again, is this a sign of a massive, larger breakthrough? Is the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk going to get rolled back in its entirety? No. And that's not the objective with this. But what it is showing is 2 things. One is that the Ukrainians now can push back in the on Russian forces because they're not so badly outmatched. 2, that Russian forces, that Ukrainians have a playbook to take the fight to Russian forces and not incur a massive number of casualties. That's been one of the biggest problems here, is that Ukrainians are excellent have highly refined defensive tactics in which the Russians have to leave their positions in advance. But it's not clear they've ever been able to evolve sustained offensive actions against entrenched Russian positions. This is the first time we're seeing kind of the new playbook emerge. Now, before we talk about where Russia is getting its remaining troops, and of course, the responses to this Ukraine mineral deal, I wanted to mention, of course, if you guys haven't signed up for Combat Vet News, today is the day. Why? Because we're taking a look at more uncensored combat footage. It's Thursday. That means it is live currently. Plus, if you're a lieutenant tier and above, you got access to the Q&A that also just dropped today. So we've got some footage that was actually sent to me by the guys fighting in Touretsk, which seems absolutely fucking crazy. I'm going to take a look at that, plus some other footage leaked out of the front lines. So if you want to support me, keep me independent, and get access to the most recent uncensored combat footage, plus the archive going back to the start of the war, combatvetnews.com. And thanks to all you guys that have signed up. It really is the thing that enables me to continue to do this. Now, I wanted to point out, again, this is an article from February 3rd from the Moscow Times, one of the only independent news agencies operating in Moscow, or operating in Russia, mentioning that military recruitment in Moscow has dropped 80% since its peak in mid-2024, around the time of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. Right, Russian authorities are relying increasingly on foreign mercenaries, criminals, and debtors to help bolster troop numbers. And that is even with a massive sign-on bonus, $19,000, which is just huge by Russian standards. The average Russian worker, admittedly not in Moscow, but the average Russian worker earning about $700 a month. So that represents what is that? Something in the realm of 2 years worth of earnings. So really a massive sign-on bonus. But they reportedly, foreign nationals from places like China, Ghana, and South Africa have begun enlisting in noticeable numbers. And what's even more interesting is that these guys are arriving in groups at Moscow's central enlistment office. Now, they said officials at the station said a pattern in which small clusters of foreigners, sometimes up to 10 at a time, seemingly arrive all together at the recruitment centers. But there's no clear evidence of a systematic foreign recruitment program. And again, this smells like some kind of Russian either intelligence operation or simply a commercial operation in which people look the other way. And this, of course, makes sense. We've seen a lot of these kind of programs emerge in these developing countries in which foreign nationals will open offices where they say, hey, I'm going to get you a visa to Russia. Sometimes they will outright lie to the individuals. They'll say, oh, you're going to be working in the occupied territories, but you're going to be doing things like building infrastructure. You're going to be constructing homes or barracks in Russian military bases. And they say, well, I can do that. I can build a house, or I can help dig a trench on the third line. And then they arrive and they find out they're infantry assault troops. But some of these individuals seem to be recruited by these companies with full transparency. And some of them report actually saying, oh, my friend, my cousin, my brother, he signed up and texted me and said, hey, the money is really good. The Russians are feeding us pretty good. And nothing terrible has happened to me yet, so you should sign up too. And it's a great chance to get you and your family a visa to Russia and a chance to earn a ton of money. I mean, can you imagine what $20,000 would get you in Ghana? Just absolutely mind-blowing. So I think this is a questionable tactic. But again, a recruit from China, for example, said that he needed money to care for his sick parents and admitted uncertainty over the legal status of his enlistment. Another recruit from Bangladesh said he was following a friend who had joined weeks earlier. All of this kind of smells like desperation, right? And I think this is not going to be sustainable for very long. You hope that the international community, again, slowly cracking down on these things, like we often saw from Indian and Bangladeshi troops who were recruited. The U.S. and the Indian and Bangladeshi government put pressure on Russia to no longer accept and to repatriate many of those fighters who reported being coerced. But again, it's unclear how true that is. Now, I wanted to talk about this mineral deal because it remains very controversial. And again, very few people seem to have actually looked at the actual text of the mineral deal, which remains very sparse on details. And this is one of the reasons why I think actually Ukraine's cabinet of ministers has said, yes, Zelensky, you can sign this mineral accord. Now, this is again, something that has been way wound down. You notice there is no $500 billion total in the deal. There's so much of the deal that really does not contain any of the terms that Trump initially wanted, right? Now, Politico, which admittedly a a left of center outlet for sure, said that it was a bad deal because nobody really knows how many rare earth minerals Ukraine has. And I guess that's a fair point, right? The estimates are based on Soviet-era surveys carried out in the 60s and 80s, and they are pretty frequent, and that Ukraine actually has a desperate need for reconstruction cash. That's obviously definitely going to be true, as they point out. A lot of houses have been destroyed. I mean, whole states are being wiped out. Transportation, again, something that has been also destroyed. Roadways, train lines, etc. Energy, something that, the Russians have been very active in targeting Ukrainian energy production. So And of course, agriculture, right? As we've talked about, anywhere that there was artillery fire or mining operations conducted, those fields need to be demined or scanned for unexploded ordnance. And that is going to be a multi-billion dollar and multi-decade likely economic task, right? And so the deal that actually got inked is, one, very light on details at baseline. It simply says that later on we're going to negotiate a fund agreement, and that'll have all the important details. But the thing is, it's going to create a fund that is effectively the Ukrainian government putting money in for investment in Ukraine. And that the U.S. is only going to say, hey, we just want to maintain veto power, right? We want to control a portion of the fund, but if you can't ever get money out of the fund, then it's not really yours, right? You might recall that that's a very common crypto scam in which individuals are told, hey, there's this investment in this cryptocurrency, it's going to only go up. And when they do, they see the crypto value only go up. But when they say, hey, I need to withdraw my earnings, they actually say, no, you can't withdraw it. There's no withdrawal mechanism. And that's the thing with this fund. It doesn't have a withdrawal mechanism. It's only usable to reinvest in Ukraine. And that can only be done with the approval of the Ukrainian government. Both parties have to agree. So you see how, in some ways, this may actually prove to be very beneficial for Ukraine because it's going to have an external check on potentially corruption, right? Now, obviously, Ukraine is a country with a considerable level of institutionalized corruption, but having to say, hey, the United States, we have the right to say, hey, listen, this fund, we think this is going to a Russian-backed oligarch, and we don't want to see him own a mining concern, so we can't let the funds be dispersed here. That'd be the more responsible thing. The U.S. could also sort of be more nefarious and say, hey, we don't want to see it go to a Ukrainian mining concern. We want to see it go to a U.S. mining company to operate these mines here. So either one is possible, but there's also another carve-out, which I thought was really interesting, which says that the only funds that can go into this deal are funds that are not yet allocated by the Ukrainian government, meaning that ongoing revenues that the Ukrainian government receives are not going to change. It's only going to be post-war development, which, again, incentivizes the United States to ensure a robust post-war deal. And the U.S. has an incentive to ensure that there's a level of infrastructure development. So again, the actual text of the deal is a long way from what Trump said he was going to get, which is a check sent to the United States by Ukraine. Again, it's one of those things where actually I think if Trump wants a deal and to high five himself, and take a victory lap to say, hey, they said they weren't going to do this deal, and they did. But at the end of the day, it's not much more than what Ukraine is probably going to do anyway, which is use its existing industries to try to rebuild itself. Again, a better deal, and perhaps one they could sign with Europe, would be actually like an IMF loan or even just grants from Europe to say, hey, here's just cash to use to rebuild your infrastructure so that we, Europe, can continue to trade with you in a robust way. Because again, Europe knows that it is both a security and economic risk to have an extremely impoverished neighbor sitting right next to you. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergey Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our lieutenant tier members. I appreciate you guys so much, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.